Mr. Barry, can you give me the thumbs up again? Perfect. All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry that we're doing this session while a tropical storm is coming through. I know that there are places in Warren that have no power right now. So I understand we probably don't have everybody that we would have had. As long as my power stays consistent, we'll have a recording of the session that we can post on the website later today. We did make it through the entire middle school session, ended just a half an hour ago. So that recording is also online, and many of the questions in the overview are comments. So that is another resource for people as well. Thank you for making the time to be here. My name is Dr. Mingle, superintendent. We have various members of our district and school leadership team on the call, and several of them will be speaking and answering questions that were pre-submitted during this hour here. So just kind of a quick overview to our agenda today. We're going to provide a brief summary of the key details regarding our school district reopening plan that was approved by the Board of Education last night. We will respond to the most common high priority questions that parents submitted ahead of time regarding information people told us they needed to make a decision as best they could for their family. The Warren Township School District website, warrentbue.org, has a wealth of additional information. It has copies of everything from last night's board meeting, the graphics, the videos, the presentation slides, so that there's lots of information for people who want it. If other questions arise, if you hear something and that generates for you a follow-up question or something you're wondering about, you can add that to the chat box. And we will address those if we have time at the end of the meeting. And if not, or either way, we'll document them to add them to our frequently asked questions page and to other communications down the road. So I'd like to start with the sentiment that closed that video, which is things are going to be different. And the model we're talking about today is how we will reopen schools in September. And I'll talk in this presentation a little bit about the process to go, hopefully, to more in-person learning for more kids at more times over the course of the school year. But we all have to start getting ourselves ready for the fact that even in person, school is going to look and feel significantly different than what we normally think of as an elementary school experience. And we'll talk about that as we get in further into the Q&A as well. The graphic on the screen right now, which I know that the letter, it's too small to read on a Zoom call, but this graphic is live on our website in a clickable version that you can zoom in on and go through. But it allows us to talk about some of the really big items very quickly, and then we'll go into more detail in the Q&A. So I'm just going to walk through it briefly. The model for September is what we're calling hybrid 1.0, where students will be assigned to one of two cohorts. Cohort A will come to school every Monday and Tuesday. Cohort B will come to school every Thursday and Friday, and Wednesdays will rotate between the two. So one week cohort A will come on Wednesday, the next week cohort B. That will be balanced over the course of time so that, on weeks where there's holidays or other kinds of school, we'll adjust the calendar to make sure that we have approximately the same number of days for each cohort. This is in alignment with the Watchung Hills Regional High School. And while that doesn't matter to families who don't have high school students, it matters a great deal to families who have both elementary and high school students so that we can work as hard as possible to get students onto the same schedule and manage transportation as well. Parents have the option, that hybrid is our default. That is what we assume most people will select, but parents have the option to select full-time distance learning. Those classes will be taught by certified Warren Township teachers and follow a daily schedule that is the same as what the students in the school facilities are having. Mr. Kimmick will talk more about that in a few minutes. We are, one of the highest priorities from our health officials is that we maintain physical distancing, which means 6 feet at all times between our students and between our students and staff and between staff. As you may have seen yesterday, the governor issued new guidance to schools about face coverings that now require that all students in a school facility must wear a face covering at all times. That was changed yesterday. That is different than previous communications we put out. This is kind of the nature of things right now. Every day we get new information and we have to be able to respond to it. So we don't have the option of waiving that. That is the requirement from the governor that through executive order. Symptom monitoring, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on as well, but there's a role for all of us to play in making sure that only well students and staff come to school. So there will be information shared with parents as we get closer to the opening of school about symptoms that you should look for each day, and that by sending your child on a bus or into a school facility, you are confirming that they're not showing any of those symptoms. Same for our staff. That symptom list, as you may have been seeing through CDC publications, is quite extensive and includes a lot of things that are just typical elementary school illnesses. That could be the common cold, seasonal flu, allergies, which makes it quite complicated because those symptoms will exclude students from school this year under the guidelines from the CDC. Special education. So students in our ABA autism program, our LLD programs, will be attending with both in-person cohorts A and B. Families that that's affected by will be notified of that separately. All other special education, 504 services, basic skills, academic support, English language learning, those services will all be offered in either the distance learning model or the hybrid so that parents can choose, and we will provide the services wherever we meet the student. Our schools will essentially be shut down to visitors with very few exceptions. I'm in direct contact with the Warren Township Health Officer who serves about 3 or 4 communities in our area. We have meetings every Monday to talk about updated health guidance. Some of the information I'll share with you later on in the presentation.
Go get your mac and cheese out of the fridge, honey, before it gets too cold.
Some of the information I'll share with you later in the presentation, we already know is tentative. Our local health officials respond to new information from the state health department, from the CDC, and the governor's office as well. Accommodations. We will accommodate student and staff members with underlying health conditions. The CDC has a list of higher risk conditions with reasonable accommodations as best we can. That'll be reviewed by the medical professionals that serve that staff member or student, as well as the school district physician. If you have a child with a significant health condition where you think they might need accommodations, like through a 504 plan, it's very important that you get in touch with your school building as soon as possible, if you haven't already. That would include if you believe that there's a need for an accommodation regarding face coverings. So the accommodation for a student who cannot wear a face covering is likely to be distance learning. So I just want to make that clear. So it's because of the governor's executive order yesterday, we need to make sure everybody's able to wear face coverings that are in our building. So it's very important. That's very individualized based on medical information that you reach out to your school nurse or the school front office, and they can help get you to the right place. We will provide at all grade levels opportunities for hand washing. At the elementary school, this is a little bit easier because many of our classrooms have sinks in them, so it's a little bit easier to schedule it. At the older grades where there are not sinks everywhere, we will schedule that into the daily routine. Where that's not available, hand sanitizer is the backup. It's not the primary, as we all know. Students, again, will be assigned to AB cohorts. I know that that information is essential to your planning for childcare and coordinating with neighbors and friends and everything else. Our goal, that the high school announced their plan last night as well. So our goal, once we know how many kids are coming back this week through the registration process, is to get that information to you as soon as possible. It won't be this week. maybe late next week or the week after, but as soon as we can say for sure that we know whether students are in an A or a B, we'll get that information out. Students will remain with their homeroom pretty much at all times. And that's typical at the elementary school anyway, but for those of you that also have middle school students, that's a change of practice at the middle school. Ventilation and transportation will both come up later, but we're increasing the fresh air through our regular ventilation system. Mr. Pate will mention that later. Transportation. So you have the option as a parent to waive your rights to transportation that we are obligated to provide you. Because of the way the state law is written, that waiver is for the school year, not an ongoing waiver. So my recommendation would be, if you can't commit to driving your child to and from school for the entire school year, then don't waive it. Just say you need it. Even if you decide not to use it, there will be a seat reserved for your child. It's better for us to have a seat for your child and not need it than the other way around. So if you're only waive the transportation, if you know, you definitely can provide parental transportation throughout the school year. Signage, we'll have signs posted about physical distancing and hygiene as reminders. I'm going to go into more detail about contact tracing later on, so I'm going to save that. We already have very high levels of cleaning and sanitization in our schools following the CDC guidelines, which will obviously be maintained. Lunch and recess do not occur in hybrid 1.0 as they are single session days, but when we move to longer days, there are very specific requirements about how we manage lunch and recess. We will be providing in the single session days breaks for snacks and physical activity. As much as possible, we'll get kids outside for things like physical education. Obviously, we're in New Jersey, so we're a little bit limited by weather for some of that, but we'll maximize the time outside where we can. After school activities at the elementary school will be virtual, meaning that we will, like we did in the spring, we will offer a menu of options across the schools that students can engage in after the school day is over. Flexibility, this is one of the most common questions that has come up so far. You will have the ability to change your decision with 30 days notice. So what we're asking is that you make a commitment in the next 2 days to how we're going to open the school year. If you're not sure, choose hybrid. It is much easier for us to accommodate moving a student from in-person school to full distance learning than the other way around, because we're going to assign students to homerooms and cohorts and make all kinds of decisions about staffing around how many students are in our facilities. So if you're not sure right now, I totally understand that. Choose hybrid in person. And we'll continue communicating even when schools are open on a weekly basis about the progress. So, and I thought the other thing that might be helpful is to see what the continuum looks like. So where we are today, or where we were when the school year closed, is all the way to the left of this diagram, where we were in 100% distance learning, our facilities were closed. Where we will open for students on September 8th is hybrid 1.0. These are single session days. The exact start and end times are to be determined, because we need to work out transportation, and we needed to hear with the high school because we share transportation with the high school. But we'll be working on that in the next several days to communicate as soon as possible the exact start and end times of our schools. We'll be operating at about 50% capacity with A and B groups, as we already talked about. And if you look all the way to the right, our goal is to get to where we were a year ago. All students in school for full days. That's where we all want to be. So there's not a parent, a student, a staff member, a board member who doesn't want us to get back to normal as soon as we can safely do so. And the way we'll go across that continuum in either direction is primarily based on the guidance of our health officials. So under the executive order, we are required to follow the guidance of our health officials. So if they tell us it's safe to open further, then we will. If they tell us it's not, then we won't. That'll be based on all kinds of data that they have access to that we don't personally. We also need to make sure that our students and our staff can comply. So it's very difficult to manage physical distancing and face coverings at all times. And, I don't know about everybody else on the call, but I personally have not worn a face covering for more than maybe an hour or two at a time so far. And we are going to ask our students and our staff, as young as our preschoolers, to wear a face covering for 4.5 or 5 hours every single day. That's a pretty big ask. And so we have to be thinking about, is that even reasonable? How are we going to manage that? How are we going to help support them through that? How do we build in breaks? What can we be doing over the next month to get ourselves ready, to get our kids ready, so that they're able to manage those conditions? Moving to full days is very much dependent on our ability to keep those practices going. The other thing I want to mention about this criteria is it is possible that we will have to move across the continuum for small groups of students, even maybe an individual classroom. So I'll talk more about what happens if there's a positive case later on, but it is possible that an individual classroom will have to move from hybrid 1.0 to full distance learning at some point and back and forth because of COVID-19 exposure. It is also possible that once we reopen under hybrid 1.0, we determine that we have enough space or enough staffing that we can increase the number of kids coming back full time, maybe for the whole kindergarten. And then we can move that group to hybrid 2.0 or transition to traditional. So I just wanted to mention that this continuum is flexible and we'll make adjustments as we go through the school year, probably on a monthly basis. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kimmick, Curriculum Director, to walk us through some the instructional topics.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mingle. We thought it'd be good just to start with a brief review of the schedule that was discussed last night. One of the things I think that's important to keep in mind with this particular slide is that this is still a draft in the sense that building principals are really primarily charged with developing the schedules for their buildings, making staff assignments, and coordinating how this will look as it's translated to the building operations. But this gives us a model in terms of what our expectations would be for a typical day for a student in the hybrid setting. The idea with this, again, is if you think about hybrid A in person Mondays and Tuesdays, and hybrid B being distance on Mondays and Tuesdays, and then we're flipping that on Thursdays and Fridays, where hybrid B is in person and hybrid A is in distance. It's important to realize that division is really among homerooms. So when we think about if a class has 22 students in it or 20 students in it at, say, a fourth grade level, 10 of those students would be attending on Mondays and Tuesdays in person. 10 of them would be distance on Mondays and Tuesdays, and then that would rotate on Thursday and Friday. So part of our goal is to really, within both hybrid cohorts, to really support students with direct support from teachers daily in both environments. So when we think about the course sequence, when we think about the way that expectations are for curriculum delivery, that expectation is the same in terms of the sequence and the same in terms of the learning progression for both groups of students. Also, when you look at the Wednesday day, this is a blue column, but really we could take either one of these yellow columns and just insert it into the Wednesday column. We would follow the same schedule for those students when they're on in-person days. And we will balance the schedule so students have approximately the same number of in-person days as their peers in the other hybrid group. So that's work that will take place, and parents will have a clear calendar in terms of when students will be attending school in order to balance out the number of in-person days across the year. It's also important to recognize that students that are at home, so if they're at a full distance or if they're just in the distance hybrid cohort for that day, the expectation is that students will follow the same schedule as their in-person peers. So a schedule will be issued. The idea is that students will be logging in to work directly with teachers on those given days, that we're looking to increase opportunities for synchronous supports and synchronous instruction this year, and having that be very different than it was in the spring, and providing opportunities again for really direct support to take place for all students, whether they're in distance or in person, on those instructional days across the week. What will vary is just the sequence of the schedule for students by grade level, because the issue of building in play and snack breaks that would be age appropriate for students is something that principals will have to vary, so we can make sure that those are addressed appropriately with coverages, and make sure that we can provide students spaces to be able to do those things if it's not taking place within the classroom. We mentioned also last night the what I need period. Remember, the what I need period is really designed with the idea that students, again, will have very specific needs. And part of what we're talking about is individualizing goals for students that are really specific to the growth that we would expect students to make. So as we collect assessment information from students at the beginning of the school year with some of the common measures that we're going to be using, the goal is to identify, what the growth would be for those students, or expected growth would be, and then to provide additional supports for that. So that's really an individualized period where students that need additional challenge can receive additional challenge, but students that need additional support and practice can also receive opportunities to have that. And that, you can see, is really present in both environments, like an in-person and a distance, but it's that idea of again, catering that support somewhat for students and recognizing that students are going to come to us with different needs. And we're going to have to do some work in terms of identifying how we best support those students and providing time for that. You'll also notice that there's a lot of time built in, again, for arrival, dismissal, for transitions and hand washing. All of those things are going to take longer in this environment. So it's important to recognize that something as simple as washing hands is going to have to actually adhere to certain guidelines that again, are being developed and will need to be applied to those scenarios. Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Mill. Could we go to the first question, I guess? So this idea of, will there be training sessions for students to learn how to navigate the many platforms that were used previously, and for parents to be more effective elementary school teachers? One of the things that I want to emphasize is that we will be one-to-one in all grades in our district. So grades K through 8 will have access to one-to-one device. Students will be expected to bring back and forth from home and to school their devices if they're in a hybrid model. So students in kindergarten will have iPads. Students in grades 1 through 8 will have access to Chromebooks. And in the primary grades, those will be touchscreen Chromebooks to just facilitate access and easier access in the same way that you would have for the iPad. One of the things also that we're looking at is really trying to have increased access, because we know we'll have that, to paper-based materials. So we're not going to be over-reliant on the technology. We also want to balance out the use of paper-based materials, especially at those younger ages, in order to provide more age-appropriate kinds of activities for students to do, and to reduce the amount of screen time that they're having both in person and at home. So, but regarding digital platforms, that's going to be a focus of work for teachers at the onset of the school year. And teachers will receive training if there's new platforms that we're talking about rolling out. But at the very beginning of the school year, in those first sets of in-person days, we will be providing direct instruction to students, especially at the primary grades, about how to access Google Classroom if that's new to them, making sure that they understand how to use certain applications. And the balance on this is that since we have in-person opportunities with these students, we can actually have similar types of activities taking place in school and at home to provide just a degree of continuity for students, and an expectation that certain applications will be used in both settings, which is how many times a first grade classroom or a kindergarten classroom would have functioned. They would have been working in centers, and there would have been activities that would have been sometimes technology based, and we would have rolled those out to students and provided access to them at the start of the school year. Right. Regarding the parents, I just want to mention that, one of our goals is to create a parent resource library that is available to parents, so we can direct parents to just short videos that will also support parents on how to use the tools and what to expect when the students are using them at home as well. So that's one of our goals this summer, is to develop that and have that available for families as well. Okay, thank you, Dr. Mingle. Will students across the district be learning the same thing? The expectation is that the curriculum implementation will be consistent across the 4 elementary schools. We did a lot of work at the end of our flexible instruction days last year to gather input from the teachers about areas that they felt would be important to emphasize at the onset of this school year with regard to certain practices for students. What may vary are goals that are established for individual students based on assessment data, and that relates back to that what I need period, and also the idea of really being able to measure growth that students are making across the year. And that's always been the case at the elementary grades. And that idea of individualizing instruction and providing really instruction that's targeted at the curriculum, but also targeted at student needs. Okay, next slide, please. So consistency and standards of virtual instruction, and how will that be monitored and enforced? I think the idea of enforcing that, the idea is again, I think I prefer the term oversight on that, but the goal is to have a common standard across digital and in-person environments. So to have consistency between the types of virtual things that are taking place using a digital tool, but also the types of asynchronous types of activities that students may do that will be more paper-based. And I think we want students that are either full distance or hybrid to have equal access to paper-based materials. So we'll be setting up systems that will enable parents to either pick up materials for students that are full distance. The students that are in hybrid will have contact time with teachers 2 or 3 days a week. So there's the opportunity to make sure that students have access to those materials over the course of those 2-week periods that are coming to school for those 5 days. The overall approach is really to establish increased continuity for students between the learning environments by having consistent expectations, consistent strategies, and consistent standards. Okay, next slide, please. What class sizes will be at 50%? Really, that's a measure of space. So all classes that exceed space as defined by the social distancing guidelines will be at 50% capacity. So a homeroom class would need to be divided into 2 pods. And that would be a hybrid A group and a hybrid B group. And really what our goal is to kind of increase, I think, connectivity between like that whole homeroom class and those 2 pods together through using just different virtual strategies. Okay. If we choose all distance learning for an incoming kindergarten, will we be required to attend daily live meetings, or will there be non-live meetings? And if we don't make live meetings, will that affect moving on to first grade? Again, our default is that we would like for students to follow the schedule that's being presented. So again, just like we did in adjustments to summer fun this year, students were logging in, they were having a meeting with the teacher, then they were receiving an assignment, working independently, and the teacher was available to support individual students. If for some reason a student couldn't do that, there was a condition in the home, we do recognize that that lesson that is actually being delivered, or that support session for a student, may have to be recorded in some way, and that would be an asynchronous option that parents would be able to access. But I think an important part of the in-person and at-home K experience are creating just opportunities for students to have socialization, to have appropriate play breaks, and really maintaining connectivity for students with their peers. But again, I think that's going to be a challenge as we kind of move forward. And I recognize that parents that may be picking full distance are wondering how will we do that. And I think that gets into our rostering and how important it is that we have count so we can make sure that we're planning for those conditions. What will the elementary day look like? Sitting at desks all day, recess? It's going to look different, and I think that that's something that we continue to emphasize. We are required to adhere to social distancing guidelines. As Dr. Mingle mentioned before, students will be required to wear masks, and I think that that's a challenge for students. Recess, we're not going to have lunch, so we're not having recess, but we are looking to build in play breaks for students, so students have the opportunity to socialize. But what we are emphasizing is that we are going to have to teach students how to do a lot of these things, especially at the elementary grades. So if we're talking about having a play break, we still have to kind of adhere to social distancing guidelines. So we're going to have to provide students really direct instruction on how we do this in a way that's appropriate, and how we do this in a way that kind of maintains a personal space and actually allows students to have opportunities that they feel would be a play session, but also does so in a way that maintains everybody's safety and adheres to those guidelines. Will distance learners be assigned to a teacher cohort from their home school? This is really an unknown at this point. We may need to adjust staffing assignments to address what parent responses are in terms of distance learning and hybrid learning. So when we think about creating that level of community, our goal is to assign students to a consistent teacher. What we are saying is that we don't want to create an environment where we have, if it's a hybrid kind of situation, where we have one person solely responsible for the in-person and one person solely responsible for the distance. We want to really have more fluidity in terms of how we're doing that. For people that are full distance, it's the same type of measure. We want to make sure that if we're creating a cohort of students, that student has a continuity in terms of the teacher that they're assigned to, so they have a feeling of connectedness with the teacher and also a feeling of connectedness with other peers within that cohort. Will DL participate in reach, compacting, and I'm assuming DL means distance learning, participate in reach, compacting, and bend. And the expectation is that they would have access to those services. When we think about instrumental lessons, that's something that Mr. Weber or Ms. Backus at the elementary grades have been working on already with regard to how that will be orchestrated. Some of that may take place distance though. You know, it's entirely possible that may take place as a more of a distance model that is facilitated when students are at the home because of some of the challenges with respect to instruments. But it's not that we don't want those opportunities to be embedded. It's just that we have to evaluate the setting for that. Regarding additional supports like compacting and reach, you know, this is an example of programming that could be addressed through the win periods. When we think about what students need, if those students need additional challenge, that's what we would be looking to provide during those periods where other students might need additional practice scenarios. So that is something that would take place both in distance learning and in the in-person schedules. Will distance learners be provided with textbooks and workbooks? You know, as I mentioned last night, the intent is that we would set up a system where students that are in distance learning would first be able to have access to the technology device that's being assigned to them. Also, that students would be able to pick up materials that are needed to actually engage in the distance learning assignments and you know, be on the same par with what the hybrid peers may be doing at that point. And I'll mention this again, the biggest challenge we had last spring was not being able to access paper-based materials and do so in a fluid way. So I think one of the things that we're looking at with regard to the start of this school year is making sure that we have systems in place that are going to facilitate the access to paper-based materials, because that provides a balance of work for students, especially for our youngest students in terms of the nature of the kind of work that they would be doing, both in class or in person and distance. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mingle.
Thank you, Mr. Kimmick. We'll turn it over to Mrs. Lenhart.
Before I address the very first question, I'd like to address, based on some emails I've been receiving this morning, as well as a question that was put out in the chat box. Transportation will continue to be offered to all students in the Warren Township School District. The reason there's a question on the Genesis parental letter is we wanted to give parents an avenue by which they could inform the district that they intend to drive their students, and this will help the district optimize routes and student assignments. But that in no way means that the district is not offering the full array of transportation that it has always offered, whether you're under 2 miles or over, under 2.5 miles or over. Now on to the question, how will busing will be handled? Students will be required to wear a mask from the time they get on the bus until the time, until the time they get off the bus in the afternoon, right? So from the time they get on the bus in the morning till the time they get off in the afternoon. We will be most likely changing routes, which would also affect times. The routes themselves cannot truly be calculated until we have a hybrid breakdown. In addition to the hybrid breakdown, which will be half the students, right, A and B, there will also be some students who are doing wholly distance learning, and there will also be some students who are doing the hybrid, but their parents are driving them. So we have to wait for that to finalize to be able to say what that really means in terms of times. The times for the school day have not been finalized yet, although it's an active conversation. The bus times and the school times will obviously have to align. And regarding staggered pickup and drop off, that is part of the design, which is currently underway. I think I put everything together in one answer.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Lenhart. I'll turn it over to Mr. Pate. I know we've been dealing with some facility issues due to the wind. Mr. Pate.
Yep, I'm here. So our plastic divider is being installed. The current plan is to maintain social distancing. We are currently going to use some dividers where this distancing cannot be maintained. But this is still, it is still, as you can imagine, an ongoing conversation. A ventilation system put in place. We currently have ventilation systems in the buildings that bring in fresh air. Currently, they bring in about 10% of fresh air. This is going to be upped throughout the district to bring in 20 to 25% fresh air, as this is our current guidance, is to increase the amount of fresh air in the space. Cleaning protocols, will be opening school at a level 2 cleaning, which will be a nightly disinfecting of all surfaces and touch points, and this will be adjusted as things change as the year goes on.
Okay, I know Mr. Ressa lost power in the beginning of this meeting. Mr. Ressa, if you got here through some other way, let me know. If not, we'll go to other topics and come back to Mr. Ressa.
Dr. Mingle, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, good afternoon. I apologize, everyone. I lost power in my residence, so I was able to call in, and I am on the phone and able to answer those two questions, I believe. Dr. Mingle, just since I can't see the presentation,
No problem.
I believe the first question is, will students with IEPs receive the same support, and if so, how are we notified?
That might have been
Or
the middle school question.
how are IEPs?
How are they? Yeah,
Oh,
how are the
the other one.
IEP and 504 cohorts being handled?
That's correct. Thank you very much. Yep, I was looking at the middle school. So a great question. Students with IEPs and 504s, as Dr. Mingle and Mr. Kimmick discussed earlier, they're going to be in cohorts A and B, with the exception of our ABA and LLD programs, which will be present in school for the full 5 days. Services for all students will be delivered both in person and during distance learning days, which will include accommodations, modifications, and small group instruction as indicated in their documents. Our building principals are diligently working on the creation of schedules with the goal that students can participate with their typical peers while also receiving the supports indicated in these documents. And it's an ongoing conversation. It's one that our case managers will certainly work with our families, and our 504 coordinators, guidance counselors will also work with families to make sure that those supports are delivered to the greatest extent appropriate. The second question, I believe, is it are special services being provided live? Is that the next question?
That is. Mm-hmm.
Great. So to answer that question, special education and related services, and when we say related services, speech, occupational therapy, counseling, social skills, they will be provided live or in person for students, and depending on the weekly schedule and the hybrid distance learning format for students, asynchronous and synchronous options will likely be provided as needed. Whether it's, like I said, those different services before, but again, it will be scheduled dependent and specific. But certainly, again, we hope to deliver all those services to the greatest extent appropriate, and we appreciate the feedback and the ongoing conversation with our families to make sure the students get what they need. Thank you very much, Dr. Mingle.
Okay, thank you. Aftercare is available, so the registration is live. It's in the community briefing each Thursday. Obviously, you can't finalize aftercare provisions until you know which cohort a student is in. We understand that. So does our aftercare provider. So there's no obligation yet, but there will be before and aftercare available to students on the days when they are coming to in-school, in-person instruction. This is one of the really hard questions, and I've shared this story a couple times now about the connection, especially at the early elementary level that we're used to. This is one of those places that's going to be really hard. And I think I shared it in the last session, but just a couple days ago, I went to a place that I haven't been to in a while, and that just reopened, and they asked to take a picture so that they could post it on their social media because they were excited about reopening. And I didn't realize until after that picture was taken that nobody there knew that I was smiling because I was happy to see these people. That's the kind of experience that we have to manage. And that's kind of gets at this question too about contact, which we all need, but the limitations that are placed on us by the health guidelines. We already talked about families having the option to switch back and forth with 30 days notice. So we've received a couple times this question about if enough people go full distance, can you then let the other people come back full time? And this is really complicated because people who are choosing full distance are doing it possibly because they don't have a full-time in-person option. And if we change what the in-person option looks like, some of those people are going to change their mind. So we can't just say, once you pick distance, we're going to change what everybody in person gets. We have to think about this holistically and make changes to the entire system, as we're saying, on about a month-to-month basis. Once we know what everything looks like when we implement Hybrid 1.0, we'll know whether we have additional space available that we didn't expect to have available, if we have some staffing flexibility, and then we can make changes for subsequent months across that continuum. Will there be childcare provided to students on days when they are expected to learn virtually if both parents work full-time? Our aftercare and before care provider, AlphaBest, is working really hard. I connected them with the Warren Township Office of Emergency Management to be able to offer a during day daycare option that is not at a school facility. There's a lot of empty office space in Warren, as you might be aware, and so they are trying to work something out. The challenge is the cost of those facility rentals are at such a high rate by square foot that the cost that we would have to pass on to make daycare happen is probably out of reach of most people. So they're trying to negotiate using our township partners to make that happen as a kind of a last option for families that don't have other solutions. So we are trying to find a solution to that. We don't have one yet. Will only certain types of masks be allowed, such as gators? So we'll make sure we share out the information from the state of New Jersey about this. As long as the face covering meets the state of New Jersey guidelines for what you would wear to go out into the community, that is what we will be expecting. What will not be okay is a face shield instead of a face covering. So the guidance from the health officials are very clear. That needs to be a cloth face covering, not a face shield. Students can wear both if they want because they protect from different things, but a face shield does not replace a face covering. So gators are okay. Okay, so this is a big one, and I think this is a really important one to give a little bit of a detailed overview of what happens. I'm not going to say if, I'm going to say when we have suspicion of a positive COVID-19 case or symptoms of a COVID-19 case. What I'm reading from is a draft provided us by our local health official last week. As I said, we meet on a weekly basis. I know there will be changes to this as guidance changes, but based on where we are right now, I think it gives a good flavor of what the in-person experience will be like. And symptom-based, as I said earlier, means things like a runny nose. It's, there are things that will wind up not being COVID that we have to treat as if they are until we know for sure. So scenario one, a student or a staff member exhibits symptoms of COVID-19. So student or staff member exhibits symptoms to COVID-19. That might include a fever, doesn't have to. The immediate action is that student or staff member is sent home immediately, and we instruct them to get a COVID-19 test. That is what we were told to do by the health department. The problem that you can all predict is, and our health officials are telling us is, the testing system may break down when schools reopen. Because although we have really good capacity in New Jersey right now, if on the first day of school, 1,000 students are sent out to get COVID-19 testing, there might be a big challenge. The rest of the class or the cohort is evaluated to determine whether or not they have potential exposure. And that exposure is defined as a close contact, which the CDC says is you're within 6 feet of the person for more than 10 minutes. This speaks to why it's so important that we maintain our physical distancing. Because if students are more than 6 feet apart, even if there is an outbreak, they may not have to be excluded, at least not for as long, once we can isolate them. If the students are 3 feet apart, we're gonna have to exclude all of them for the entire duration, which at the CDC guidelines is, if there's a symptom, minimum 10 days before the person can come back to school or work. So that's a pretty significant move to distance learning, for even if it's just a symptom that turns out not to be COVID-19. So that's obviously quite significant. The person who will make the decision about how far the quarantining or isolation goes is our local health official. The school nurses have been working with our health department all summer long, doing contact tracing for the community. So they're very well informed on this topic. They will work with the health officials and with you. Second scenario, what if a student or staff member has a family member or somebody in their home that has a positive or potential positive case? If in that case, it's only the student from that home that would have to be isolated. It is not the other kids in that class. And that's because they didn't have a close contact with the actual positive case. So it's kind of like a 6 degrees of separation thing. The guidance from the CDC and our health officials is, you're only isolated if you personally have the direct contact within 6 feet for more than 10 minutes, regardless of whether you're wearing a face covering. If we find out that a student or a staff member has somebody in their home that tests positive, we have to send that person home. We might recommend, meaning the health department might recommend that they get tested. They might not, it depends on the circumstances. That student or staff member will be instructed to quarantine for 14 days following the last exposure to that COVID-19 positive person. So again, we have to be prepared that we might have individual students or cohorts that have to go into distance learning at any time. The school administration will be notified of close contacts by the health department. So that's how we'll find out about it. Obviously, if you know of something earlier, we would appreciate you letting the school nurse know, because we can get ahead of it and minimize exposure faster. What about if there's an actual positive test? That's all just based on symptoms. What if there's an actual positive test? The student or staff member is sent home if they haven't already been. They must isolate under CDC guidelines for 10 days from the first symptom and 24 hours after the symptoms go away. So it's at least 10 days, but then it's 24 hours after the symptoms clear with no medication. This is always a challenge at the elementary school level with fevers in general, never mind under these conditions. School-based contacts are identified and they must also quarantine. That's within 6 feet for 10 minutes or more. If we have stable cohorts, that might mean an entire cohort. Like it could mean an entire third grade class has to be isolated for 14 days, depending on the exposure level. It's very complicated. Every instance is going to be unique. If somebody is suspected and they test negative, so they go for a COVID-19 test and they test negative, they may return to school or work 24 hours after the resolution of any symptoms. So we sent them out because they had a symptom like a fever. It turned out not to be COVID-19. They can come back as soon as the fever or the other symptoms are gone for 24 hours. It says right on the bottom that the Department of Health is working on metrics to monitor transmission and to guide us on moving up or down in the level of rigor for these kinds of conditions. The other question that we get around this is, who's going to tell us about these kinds of things? It is the health department that notifies individuals in the community about positive tests and close contacts. People will not be notified to say, you know, a student at Central School tested positive. It will only be the families of students who are close contacts of that person. That is, the health department controls that data, and they have very specific protocols that they're required to follow. This is always a challenge when we're dealing with lice or any other communicable disease, where people want to know. Of course, we all understand that, but we are not allowed to share most of that information. At best, you'll find out there was an exposure. You're not going to know which student or which staff member because of their privacy rights. When will parents be informed of the schedules? I shared that earlier. Our goal will be to do that as soon as possible. It's probably going to take us until the week after next to be able to finalize that. The exact times of the school day, we're working on that this week. Hopefully we'll be able to finalize that by next week as well. That does require board action on the 17th to officially make school start and end times. We do know the high school times now. They announced them last night, so we'll be able to adapt to that. Are the options being presented here the final choices, or is there a chance that it could change before the school year? It will not change based on anything that we are doing internally. It may change if we are sent different information from the governor or the Department of Education. For those of you that are watching the governor's press conferences, yesterday he reduced the in-facility capacities down to 25. As of right now, we're told that doesn't apply to schools. We're allowed to open with more than 25 students, but it applies to everywhere else you would go in New Jersey. If the governor changes that guidance and tells us we must do something different, then we will react and communicate a new plan to that. But as of right now, our hybrid 1.0 is the model that meets the state guidelines and allows us to reopen school facilities in September. There will be changes, I'm sure, based on new information, and I just realized that my camera was not on. I apologize for that. We have a comment about somebody wants their children to be in opposite cohorts to allow better one-on-one attention while at home. So our default assignment will be that students are assigned to the same cohort. This makes transportation easier. They can share a seat on the bus. And for most parents, we believe that's the preference. If you have a different preference, you should reach out to your school front office and let them know that you have a different preference. We can't promise to accommodate requests like that, but it's important for us to know about those kinds of things. What are our plans to screen or monitor students or teachers on entering the building? This is one of the questions that I thought we would be answering today, but we, on Thursday or Friday, got a new set of guidance from our health officials that contradicted the previous guidance that we received earlier in the week. So I'm not going to answer the question right now because we need to finalize what the latest guidance is. At a minimum, there are visual symptom checks that have to take place as students arrive to school facilities. There's things that parents have to do at home, as I mentioned. There's questions about, there's disagreement, I should say, between the CDC, the New Jersey Department of Education, and our local health official about the taking of temperatures every day and about other kinds of methods. So until they work that out and give us a final answer, I can't communicate that. So that'll definitely happen before school opens, but we're getting conflicting information right now that we need to work through. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And while that was happening, I couldn't look at chat questions. So I'm going to ask if there are any administrators who saw questions in chat that they would like to address. We have about 10 minutes. If anybody has anything, I know I'm sure there are questions in there. Mr. Kimmick?
There were some questions about how we will know or assess students. We will be putting out just information about an assessment schedule. That's one of the action plans that we developed this summer. During summer fun, the teachers that were teaching summer fun actually piloted some materials for us so we could get a sense of how students interacted with that. We got some parent feedback from the parents of students that were actually participating in summer fun. So we're making final decisions about which instruments we want to use, but there will be a measure again of first when students transition back to school, focusing on that need to address kind of social emotional aspects and make sure that we're successfully transitioning students back, providing especially our youngest students, the explanations that are developmentally appropriate for students, and then we'll take the measures of actually doing common assessments across all 4 buildings to get a read on where students are with regard to the standards at that grade level, so we can make decisions about individual goals that we have for students and the best ways to kind of administer the curriculum going forward. So I just wanted to address that because that came up in a couple of the areas there.
There's some questions in there about staffing and our capacity. So in addition to working through the requests from families over the next couple of days, we're also working through the deadline of staff members to tell us if they need accommodations based on their own medical conditions or things like that. So it's a little bit difficult to answer the question right now about who and where and how many, because we have a lot of things to work through on the staffing side. So we may need to hire leave replacement teachers for people who request leaves and so on. So until we know all that information, it's hard to answer who, what, where, and why. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll while answering. So Mrs. Lenhard, Mr. Pate, Mr. Ressa, anything that you can address in there, and I'll keep looking as well. So there, yeah, Mr. Kimmick.
There was a question about live streaming here, and again, I want to clarify this because what we won't be doing is live streaming like a full class of students for other students to watch other students working. I think what we're looking at doing is developing strategies where teachers can actually have a combination of live streaming lessons that they would be doing, or again, setting up mini lessons that will be taking place with students that perhaps are in the distance cohort and the in-person cohort at the same time. So we want more flexibility with that, but I just want to emphasize our instructional model on a regular school year, especially at elementary grades, especially in the primary grades, did not involve a lot of whole class instruction that took place for 20, 25 minutes at a time. It would typically be a 5 to 10 minute mini lesson that would take place, and then students would be transitioning into small group lessons with a teacher or independent work or center work. And I think one of the things we're looking at is being very intentional about the way that we're designing lessons and thinking about how the tools that we're using can actually provide the students the connections that they need to be successful in the type of work that the teacher is wanting to take place in order to reach the goals and the objectives that are being established. So it's not that a synchronous or a live lesson is not going to be an option. I think teachers have to kind of make decisions about what's most appropriate for students at that point in time.
There were questions in there about ongoing feedback, and so it is our intention to continue refining and issuing wide-scale surveys that help us get information from all parents across the district about things like the student experience. As those of you that were on the board meeting last night might have heard us talk about the importance of assessing several weeks into September how it's going and making sure that we are prepared to respond and address those concerns if there, the things that go. For example, there are questions in here about summer fun experiences. We often get totally, the entire continuum. So we had public commentary at last night's board meeting praising their child's summer fun experience, specifically in special education. And there's a comment here on the opposite end. So it's very individualized, we understand that. And it's important, I think one of the things we need to emphasize is when schools reopen, school facilities in September, regardless of whether your child's in hybrid or distance learning, If you have a concern about your child's experience, you should get in touch with the teacher right away. That's part of their responsibility. And if you're not satisfied or you don't feel like that resolves your issue, then you go to the building principal and then from there to the district. So that's normal. That's our normal process. That would still be in this situation as well. We also all have to have some grace and understanding. This is, again, a completely new way of running a school district. So every single little decision we make requires a lot of consideration of very complex decisions. And so that's what we're working on, but it'll take time. And there will be things that we get right and there will be things that we get wrong, and we'll continually try to learn and improve. I think we addressed some of these. I'm trying to scroll back. Some of them were put in before we got to those questions. So what I'd like to make sure before time runs out is talk about where to go next. So obviously we're asking you to make a decision based on the information that's available right now. As I said at the very beginning, my advice to you is if you're not sure, choose hybrid. You can always choose to go to distance learning. That'll be easier for us to accommodate in 2 weeks or 3 weeks if that's something that you feel is necessary. If somebody doesn't respond, we're going to assume hybrid in our scheduling model and work towards that. But it's much better for us to have specific registration information so that our principals can do the really hard work of the scheduling process that needs to get going. The district website has a ton of information on it. It has all of the presentations. This recording will be up there this afternoon if you want to go back and re-listen to things we presented or questions and answers. The FAQ will be updated as soon as we can. We're running information sessions all day long today for various groups. So as soon as we can get to the actual FAQ document, we'll bring some of those answers in writing so that you have a reference to them there as well. We know that there's lots of unanswered questions. We're going to keep getting at them. You can always email COVID-19@warrenty.boe. That email address feeds us so that we can add those into our task list of questions that need to get addressed. So all of those things are being worked on. One thing I did want to mention, preschool. We didn't talk a lot about preschool here because it's very unique, even in a regular school year. Preschool parents, it might already have come in, but you're getting a letter today from our preschool administrative staff with specific details about what the preschool model looks like, separate from the rest of this conversation. So preschool is always different. It has to follow different sets of guidelines from the state than K through 8. And so we thought it was better just to send that small group of people a separate document so you have that information. Hopefully, it seems like we didn't lose people, so I guess power worked out okay. It stayed here as well, so our recording will be able to be posted. Thank you. The people who spoke in the meeting today, and you see several of our principals and others in the meeting as well, have been working around the clock, nights and weekends to get to where we are. We all know that there's more work to be done, but we've made a huge amount of progress in the last couple of weeks, certainly since we first announced our planning back on July 2nd, and we've been working on the return to school process since somewhere in April or May. All of that backup information is on the district website for those that are interested. If you just want the simple overviews, we've created those one-pagers as well. So thank you again for making the time to be here. We'll follow up on other questions as we receive them. We appreciate your time, and stay safe and stay well. Thank you.